Good afternoon.
Anjali, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon, sir. Director, sir. Good afternoon, Dr. Dash. Welcome to ISID.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Yes.
Santosh, I just greeted the participants. Was that audible? I wasn't hearing my mic.
Yes.
That was it. Okay, one request. In my slotted time, when I'm left with 10 minutes, please sound me up. Okay,
Sure.
and please speak into the mic. Don't text me on the chat box. I'm likely to ignore.
Okay. Yeah.
Santosh, can I be made the co-host, please? It just might be convenient at some point of time.
Yeah. I think Dhananjay must have done that. Yes, you were.
Now I'm just, yeah. Thank you.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, sir.
Yes, hello. And is Dev? Dev Kusum is already there. Very good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yes. So welcome to ISID
Thank you.
virtually. Hopefully things will normalize soon. We can have physical meetings, but right now we have to live with virtual. So shall we start? There's still 2 minutes. Anjali, what do you say?
Yes, sir. We'll start at sharp 3. I'm prepared.
Okay. So 2 more minutes. So it's 3 o'clock. So let me welcome our friend Dev Kusum and all of the members of ISID faculty to this presentation by Anjali Tandon, our own colleague, based on a project that she just finished or is finishing on measuring changes in factor proportions vis-à-vis factor endowments and inter-temporal study. I think the context for this kind of analysis or work is set by the fact that, in my view, job creation or employment generation is the most important or most critical development challenge that India faces. We add 12 million people to our workforce every year, and the organized sector is not creating enough jobs to keep them engaged. In fact, employment elasticity of our growth has been declining, and this is a serious matter because that means most of the people who join the workforce do not have decent work opportunities, not covered by social protection. They remain part of the unorganized sector, and the challenge of poverty reduction is really an impossible challenge until we are able to create decent job opportunities for all our people. So in that context, this report, I mean, I have just actually had a look through it or browsing through it. I think it's an important piece of work. It looks at the intertemporal changes in the factor proportion in Indian industry, and using input-output tables, it computes direct and indirect, use of various factors, including labor and capital, and some of the databases she has used in her work include the input-output tables generated by CSO and other people, and also claims database, and that links it up very well with the work of Dev Kusum Das. Dev Kusum has been a major contributor and a pillar of India Claims project, which is supported by RBI for many years. And and now I think Dev Kusum, are you not the president of Claims worldwide or Claims
Asia Claims. Asia
Okay.
Claims.
Okay, so that is an important recognition that Claims project Asia has elected Dev Kusum as its president, and so an Indian presiding over the Claims group Asia-wide is an honor for the country. And so Dev Kusum teaches at Delhi University, but has been a very consistent producer of knowledge or research, and also within the framework of Claims. So I think Dev Kusum is very well equipped to provide some useful comments to Anjali, which will help her, I'm sure, to sharpen her analysis for publication. And I'm sure that a good book can come out of this work with the comments made and the revisions, incorporating them have been done. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Anjali for making a presentation, and then we will have comments by Dev Kusum. And then all of us, the floor will be open for discussion. So over to you, Anjali.
Thank you, sir. So I'll share my screen and I'll start right away. My screen is seen. It can be seen? Hello?
Yes, Anjali,
Okay.
we can see.
Okay, sure. Thank you so much. So I have the following plan. I will, in the beginning of my presentation, present the broad findings of the project. And then I'll follow the discussion with slightly more details will follow. And the strategy for the day is as follows. Since the analysis is at different levels of aggregation, it's at a it's at an aggregate level for broader sectors, for sectors of the economy, and for industries. So in the presentation today, I'll concentrate and focus on aggregate level findings to give you a clue of what the project is about and how are we trying to shape a policy around these things. Details at industry level and sector levels are available in the report, for which I would request you to please refer the report. So in order to save time, as I present my work on my slides, I have highlighted some specific text in blue color. So those texts would be relating immediately to the objectives that I have set out for the project so that you can easily relate the two things together. This will help me save time at the end to discuss the policy. Okay, I'm duty bound for two acknowledgements. I must acknowledge my sincere thanks to Professor Atul Sarma for his guidance and suggestions through the work, and my floating research, younger research team that kept on coming in, walking out through the course of this project. So I must acknowledge at least these many people before I begin my presentation. So if I were to summarize this long title into one word, that would be differentiate. So this is the key takeaway from this work. Differentiate what? Differentiate different segments of the economy, if they are organized or unorganized. Different sectors of the economy, manufacturing vis-à-vis services. Different factors of production, how does labor behave, how does capital behave, and different intensities of the usage of these factors. So if sectors are more relative users of capital vis-à-vis labor, then one needs to take into account these differential behaviors when one designs a policy. The attempt in this work has been to sharpen our understanding on a nearly uniform policy impact on different stakeholders. The stakeholders are the ones that I just stated. So we generally tend to design policies for a blanket implementation, thinking that, it's almost a uniform world that we live in, but the reality is far more different. So that is what the focus of this work is. This work is initiated in the backdrop of increasing globalization and its technology effect, which occurs due to mobility of capital, easier imports, and the race to maintain competitiveness in terms of cost and quality, features, characteristics of products, etc. In effect, technology use has intensified, and this has affected different factors in a different manner. For instance, a recent work in 2017 by Professors Banerjee and Veeramani has highlighted that a differential effect for women of technology occurs. The unskilled women tend to gain jobs, whereas the skilled women also tend to gain jobs, but the net effect is negative when one takes into account that the less machinized jobs are going to unskilled women, but when the firms need a more machinized setup, then they want skilled women or men. So the net effect is negative. So the idea is that this heterogeneity is what matters, and we need to respect this when we are sitting down on a policy table. On the external front also, greater global production chains have added to pressures on wage margins and similar things, which have altogether led us to challenge the traditional Caldor's doctrine of a fixed labor capital share of 7:3 in total income of an industry or of a firm. So it has been seen for developing and developed countries that these shares have been changing and the share of labor income has gone down. What does that lead to? That leads to lower consumption because there's lesser income, so the demand is getting depressed. This also affects collection of direct taxes, and therefore there are lower expenditures for public welfare from the government. And this also leads to a greater influence and say of capital owners in the economic decisions in an economy. All these three lead to a crisis situation, which is not an outcome of the pandemic. It was there on the eve of the pandemic. We were already in this mess prior to the pandemic. So the bottom line is that the pandemic has given us new challenges, but that doesn't mean that the earlier ones have been addressed or they do not need to be considered. So we need to set our own house right. And for that, we need to see where are we coming from and what have we missed in our policy decisions, etc. So a broader literature review tells us that a greater emphasis on heterogeneity emerged little later in theories of economics. And with that, a lot of emphasis has been spent on different aspects that affect growth and transformation. But in all this, what has not been given its due attention is the role of endowments. And this is despite the fact that studies have highlighted, including those by Indian authors, that endowments are the most significant contributor when it comes to explaining the structure of an industry. So with this gap, we take forward this study. Now, theoretical framework of this study relates to at least three theories, which is location theory, where the producers are taking their decisions to take advantage of resources in order to lower their costs. Producers optimize their decisions to lower costs and maximize profits. And of course, trade theory, which is based on factor abundance and factor cost. He placed this work in new structural economics domain, where the theory states that a potential industrial structure at any given point of time should be consistent with the endowments at that point of time. So if the two are not in sync, then the growth part would be fragmented, would be shattered in the long run, and growth process would not be sustainable. So all this essentially tells us that important to identify the most suitable industries that meet a specific development criteria, and then design the policy around these industries so as to support them, rather than just finding it out what the rest of the world is doing in what specific industry. Instead of emulating, need to study what is our condition. And broadly, the analytical framework here makes use of input-output approach and other indices, which I shall be discussing in my following slides. So the broad objectives of this work are to find out what is the magnitude of indirect factor use, an element which we tend to bypass in our considerations, and what has been the impact of import utilizations on usage of these factors, how these factor proportions, that is relative use of capital vis-a-vis labor, has changed, and how have endowments changed in the economy, and how are the structural relationships of these endowments of capital and labor behaving in different segments of the economy. When I say different segments, I mean organized manufacturing, unorganized manufacturing, and unorganized services. So very quickly, right here, you see the broad findings of from these objectives. We see that over time, the indirect use of capital has been higher than the indirect use of employment. So that means our supply chains are far more integrated in terms of capital than in terms of employment. And we need to consider this. This is something which we probably are not as mindful as we should have been. On impact of import utilizations, we see that import structures have not been able to encourage our employment generation agenda. And this impact has actually worsened with time. In terms of capital, we see that importations have amounted to domestic cost savings on capital use because there hasn't been an emphasis on domestic R&D to develop capital machinery and equipment in-house. And this impact is most drastically sensed in manufacturing than in agriculture and services sectors. In terms of factor proportions, we see that employment intensity has declined and capital intensity has increased. In turn, relative use of capital has almost doubled or more than doubled in specific cases. In terms of endowments, we saw in the project that the structure is very different. The organized sector is capital intensive and the unorganized sector is labor intensive. So much so that if I show you these figures which are written in square brackets, they magnify the size comparisons. So 12, 10, and 6, it tells me that a factory in organized sector manufacturing is 12 times the size of an unorganized manufacturing sector. So these are the size differences. 10 refers to the difference with regard to labor intensive manufacturing. 6 refers to the difference regards to capital intensive manufacturing. Very interestingly, if you just look at the last figure, which is 1.5, this is very interesting to note. It tells me that my size comparisons of services, unorganized services vis-a-vis unorganized manufacturing are 0.43, 0.31, and 1.5. It shows me that my service industries overall and labor intensive are smaller in size as compared to my unorganized manufacturing. But when it comes to capital intensive services, they are more in size than capital intensive unorganized manufacturing. So see how this itself shows capital hasn't gone into manufacturing as we have been wanting for a long time. And the structural relationships are also very different. The industry structure is found to be very persistent in organized sector, least persistent in organized sector, and very persistent in unorganized manufacturing, whereas a structural change is noticed for unorganized services. So this gives you a broad feel of everything that is coming out of the project. I now take you to further details. So the methodology here is that we have worked out improvisations while computing our capital labor ratios, and they are essentially in 3 forms. We account for indirect usage, which is very important, as we just saw. We account for the effect of factors which are embodied in import utilizations, which is very important, because if we do not do that, then we are working on a very strong assumption that intensity of factor use in domestically produced and imported products is identical, which is far from reality. And we also account for a differentiated factor use in the imports which are coming from different sourcing countries. For this, we essentially use a proxy which rests on the principle of export equivalence of imports. So this is a key slide where I'm trying to show in this equation how we are using our coefficients on direct coefficients, import coefficients, export proportions to integrate everything and to reach an export equivalence of imports. And ultimately, we are feeding this measure into our equation where we are computing our total factor use as a sum of what is used in domestic production and what is used in imports. And everything is taken into account. So the details and the derivations and each of the every equations is in the report. What do we measure actually? We measure factor ratios, that is employment per unit output, which is number of persons per unit output. We measure capital, which is net fixed capital stock per unit output. Then we take their ratios and we talk about factor proportion, which is essentially relative use of capital per employee. And When we come to endowments, we note that by adding capital from organized and unorganized segments will not be an exhaustive measure, because we are likely, because my readings from National Account Statistics sources and methods informs me that we are likely to lose out on at least some MSME components in the economy. So therefore, we had to work out this IO framework, which takes into account everything. The measures of factor endowments for labor are essentially through this formula. It looks complicated, but it's very simple. So it tells me that labor of worker category W in an industry I, expressed as a proportion of total labor which is employed in all industries and of all worker types. So it's just a ratio, it's just a proportion. Capital endowment is measured as net fixed assets per total persons engaged in that industry. This includes all worker categories. Now for capital endowments, we are forced to refer to net fixed assets rather than capital stocks, because in unorganized sectors, we are constrained to compute our stock measures. So this is the kind of data that I have used, and the director, Professor Nagesh Kumar, did mention all of these. And we are really glad that the lead author of RBI claims data has agreed to join us today. So now I start showing my results. So there are essentially, computations are in three parts. We first compute factor ratios and factor proportions. Then we compute factor endowments, and then we study their structural relationship. So you see everything which is on, so this is an aggregate level slide. Everything which is in blue should be able to connect you to the objectives that I set. So you see, this talks about employment effect. And what do we see? At an aggregate level, the employment effect has gone to 1/3. So I'm talking of total employment intensity. It was 39 persons per unit per rupee million output in the year 1993-94. By 2 decades, it had reduced to 13 people, 13 persons, 13 employees per million rupees of output. So from 39, it has gone down to 13. So it's 1/3. Now look at a direct coefficient. So from 27, it has gone down to 27. But as we highlighted in our methodology, that this is the figure that really matters for us to a great extent. So it has gone down by 1/3 at an aggregate level. But if you look at the manufacturing, and the difference is 31 to 10, so the 1/3 difference is essentially coming from the manufacturing. And if you compare from agriculture and services, their employment intensities have also gone down, but not as much as in case of manufacturing. So a lot of changes are stronger in manufacturing. So indirect employment intensity is nothing but a difference of total and direct. So whereas at an aggregate level, my economy was using 37% of its employment was indirectly being used, that measure has increased to 47% in the more recent times. So the supply chain, the use of employment in the supply chain is becoming more important, and we need to account for that. Impact of import utilizations is worrisome. The negative sign shows that there is an employment foregone effect. So had it been positive, I would have jumped to say that there's an employment creation effect, which is not seen. So from 7.5, so this is in percentage, these are not numbers. So from 7.5%, that foregone effect has almost doubled to 15.9%. So that's how so each of these three is relating to my broad objectives that you have seen. Similarly, on capital, you would see that my capital intensity has nearly doubled. From 3.0, it has come to 5.8, that's almost 6.0. So it's almost double. The weakest effect is for manufacturing. So the capital effect, the capital intensity effect is lowest in manufacturing. That means capital is, that also can be used to infer that capital is shying away from our manufacturing sector. We all know that, but here are the numbers behind that. And the gravity of the situation is coming up now. So the intensity effect, the indirect intensity effect has gone up from 50% to 54. So as you saw that employment, there was a 47% indirect usage. For capital, there's a 54% indirect usage. That shows that capital indirectly is much more strongly used than employment. So everything needs to be traced to the tiniest level of the supply chain rather than just talking about the direct effects. In terms of import utilization, we saw that there's a cost saving effect, which has increased, which is magnified from 10% to 27.2. The negative sign shows that we are importing and we are not doing it in-house. And we know we don't have a sufficient R&D emphasis on that. So all that I showed you was aggregate level, but everything has been worked out at a sector level in the report. And this is a snapshot of everything. This slide has 5 pieces of information. The vertical line tells me this is the benchmark for an aggregate capital intensity. So I know sectors here are lower, sectors here have higher capital intensity. The sleeping line tells me that sectors below have a lower employment intensity, those above will have greater. So 4, 5, and then I know my benchmark, my aggregate benchmarks are also written here. So it's 13 employees per million rupees of output and 5.8 lakh rupee per million output of the capital is being used. So from this framework, one can see another piece of information is the size of the ball, the size of the bubble. So everywhere we are talking about intensities per unit, per unit, per unit. But what we also need to consider is what is the size of this sector, so that we can just come down to identification of sectors. So the bigger the size, it shows the significance in output of that sector. So for instance, S1, sector 1 is agriculture, and S17 would be a sector which is construction sector. So we know these are big output sectors. So how is it placed? Construction sector is placed in my top quadrant, where my employment intensity is above aggregate, my capital intensity is above aggregate, and see what is the size of this ball. So this is a potential sector to target for targeting for a policy. Similarly, agriculture, all these have informations which are discussed later. I'll try and come to a policy slide if my time permits on that. So now coming to factor proportions, that means relative use of capital. So here we see that relative use has increased notably, and the use has gone up 5 times. So if you take the ratio, this is 77 and this is 43, 432. So the ratio goes up by 5, 4.1 and 4.3. And the least increment relatively is for manufacturing, again showing that capital intensity, although has increased, but relatively it's the services which takes the lead, it's the agriculture which takes the lead, and manufacturing is trailing behind. So this reflects upon the low level of investment that has come to the Indian manufacturing vis-a-vis services. This is something which we need to register. And very interestingly, if I compare my manufacturing K2L ratio vis-a-vis services K2L ratio, my 1993 figures tell me that the gap was by 19%. So the K2L of manufacturing was 81% of what was in services. But so 19% of the difference was there, but that difference has grown to 22%. That means the relative capital use of services and manufacturing has diverged more over the time. So, or compared to that it should have converged, we find a diverging behavior. This is again a slide where I'm trying to make you appreciate that the work is done at sector and industry level. So I'll not concentrate much here, but I'll try to show that a lot of sectors are above the aggregate benchmark. That means K2L ratios are high for quite some of them. And this is applicable to manufacturing sector. So any code which is between 3 to 14 would be a manufacturing, and which is between 17 to 27 would be a services sector. But interestingly, you would see that the size of, so this is the output share, the size of these sectors is largely below 5%, below 5. So what is above 5 is 16, and is above 5, 16, it's 21, it's 22. And what is 16? So 16 is utilities, it's power. What is 22? 22 is financial services. What is 18? 18 is trade. So you can see all the big bubbles are service dominated. They are not manufacturing dominated. We know these things, but here there is a perspective that I'm trying to put to that. So now the implications for labor and capital are, with regard to labor, the labor which moves out will have to be, or which comes into the market, or which moves out of this manufacturing sector, has to be adaptive to newer production technologies and techniques. We'll need to have a skill upgradation mechanism which has to be demand driven and not supply driven. A business model will have to be promoted for entrepreneurs, where they will be encouraged for on-the-job trainings of employees. And I'll connect to this point later in my policy slide. And we need to pay attention for our skill upgradation for a more of a demand-driven pattern, and also, so that we can train our younger demography for newer kinds of job assignments, which we would be expecting in future, because we saw that K-12 ratios have gone up. Even for manufacturing, they have gone up, although relatively not as much as for services. With regard to capital, this is really important that we define and then stick to it and follow that objective on a mission mode, that we have to, we saw that the effect of import utilizations has gone so worse. So we really need to, buckle up ourselves so that we can do things in-house. Okay, so so the section on factor proportions is over, and now we jump into the section on endowments. Before I take you to my endowments, I want to show you the structure. So this is organized manufacturing, and the 4 key variables: number of factories, output, employees, and capital. So this is not endowments, this is capital. This is capital, not endowments. You see that everywhere the structure was always dominated by capital intensive sectors, but it has been even more dominated by capital intensive sectors. So over time, these colors, these shades have, put on their weight on the other ones. That means the structure is capital intensive structure. Now this shows that labor will probably have to move into these capital intensive sectors, and that means it will move out from labor intensive sectors. There will be compulsions. We'll talk about the compatibility also, but there are compulsions. Now what does that impact? That will impact due to lower demand, labor availability for labor intensive sectors, which would affect in turn the competitiveness of our labor intensive sectors also. And the skilling challenges, of course, are very pronounced when labor moves out from labor intensive sectors. So this slide shows you that in whatever measure you pick up, it is the capital intensive which is dominating the factory sector. Just to give you an idea, although this is not a core slide, but a lot of work has gone into this, and it's in detail in the report. So the red spots will show you over time, over these 4 years, how has the placement of capital intensive size, industry size. So this is industry wise. We are now coming from sector wise to industry wise. How has that gone up? So you would see that largely everything is wrapped up within 5% of output share. So we don't have many bigger size industries. And of all those that we have a lot of, capital intensive ones are the ones which have the size. It's not the other ones. So for instance, 131 is the only labor intensive. It happens to be finishing of textiles and weaving, spinning. This is the only labor intensive which has more than 5% share at an industry level. Interestingly, you'll see that the capital intensive cumulative share of top 5 industries, so these top 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, is 30% in total output. So that's the level of concentration within capital intensive. Whereas if I talk about labor intensive, it's just about half. So that shows the asymmetry there. So now I come to my endowments, and this slide summarizes it all, that there is a transition, and we see what has happened is that this line, which shows me contract workers, has gone up, and the endowments of male workers has gone down. And we all know that contract workers are being used to replace male workers in the organized manufacturing sector. So that's nothing new. I'll try and connect this finding to another one at a later slide. But to keep you informed that there are not very great changes with regard to supervisory labors and with regard to female endowments. The high ones in sectors that account for a large chunk of labor is textile, leather, footwear, food processing, basic metal products, and chemicals and transport equipment. So in a slightly different pattern, I'm trying to show you how capital endowments have changed in the organized sector. Now, this is a ratio of the endowment in 1993 in an earlier time to the endowment in a later time. So previous time and the later time. So you see, the larger the ratio, the greater is the change. So in petro products, my endowments of capital have gone fourfold compared down to chemicals, where they have almost been stagnant. They have gone up, but the relative change is what clearly shows me these are the places where we are finding the change, and these are the places where we should have found the change. Interestingly, if there is no change, why has labor not picked up? And interestingly, if there is so much of labor here, you can see the danger coming in, because there's so much of capital intensification coming up also here. So this is how I'm trying to compile results here. They are discussed in detail in the report. I quickly jump to the unorganized manufacturing sector. A similar parallel comparison shows you that this unorganized manufacturing, not only that it was labor dominated, L-intensive dominated, but that predominance has even more become even more predominant over time. So this is in sharp contrast to what we noticed for the factory sector, that the share of labor intensive in all parameters has expanded over time. And this probably highlights in some way or the other that these are finding constraints there. So it's not with regard to capital. So in labor intensive, unorganized manufacturing, the share of capital has not changed as much as we saw in other parameters. And why? That means the labor intensive unorganized manufacturing are actually finding limitations in access to capital intensive production techniques. So again, all these things reinforce, but we have the numbers to quantify the impact here. A similar chart here to show you that in unorganized manufacturing sector, it's a completely different picture. 40% of the top 5 labor intensive sectors have, that is the share of top 5 labor intensive, whereas the share of capital intensive is just about 23% or 24%. And these are at variance from what we saw in the factory sector. Labor endowments have adjusted in the unorganized manufacturing, where we see with regard to gender, the female labor has picked up and the male labor has gone down. So that shows that females are being used to substitute for male laborers. That also shows that perhaps the skill differential is not as much, and also that the incentive to hire low paid, the soft gender is very high. So that inequity is also coming up from here, and we need to handle this. We need to address this issue. So in unorganized manufacturing, the sectors which are most endowed with labor are textiles, leather, footwear, food processing. So broadly, textiles and food processing take the lead in the unorganized segment. With regard to hired workers and working owners, it's largely maintained, but the change is more seen with regard to gender. In terms of capital endowments, we can see again, these are ratios, and we see that wood products, it doesn't mean that the wood industry is the most capital intensive. It means that the change has been strongest for wood sector, and it has been least for machinery sector. And there's, this is something which we know. In fact, it has gone down. This is the only sector where I see it less than 1. It means that these endowments have gone really bad. And so this is machinery sector, not elsewhere classified. So this is how we see the endowments changing on sector level in the unorganized manufacturing. Coming to organized services, the structure is again labor intensive, but it is virtually no capital intensive. Everything is labor intensive. So this is a difference between unorganized manufacturing and services, and this is a difference between unorganized services and organized manufacturing. So it's predominantly labor intensive structure. To show you the output structure here again, it is very important to know that the labor, so see, the shares are so small. That means services are far more fragmented than manufacturing, tinier ones and more. So for instance, we have, and at 3-digit level, we have 71 manufacturing industries, and we have about 119 service industries. So there are more and tinier. Top labor intensive services account for more than half of the share of, output of their labor share. And this is insignificant in capital intensive. So if labor issues have to be addressed, this is the segment that has to be thought about. Endowments in labor intensive, very interestingly, that this endowment has happened again for male. Okay, so this is different from unorganized manufacturing. The male endowments have gone up and the female endowments have gone down. And what could be the reason? The reason is very counterintuitive, but the way I could figure out is as follows, that services are dominated by trade-related activities, and trade-related activities have a lot of male gender involvement, brokerage, movement, transportation, those kind of things. So these are not activities where female workers or employment would find an easy place and space. So, and it is the trade which has expanded between the 2 decades. So that's why the female endowments are going down and the male are going up, because of the nature of the services which have taken off in the unorganized sector. The second rankers are hotels and restaurants. Now here also there's a lot of migrant labor involved, migrant workers involved, which are more likely to be males than females. There would be some, but definitely dominated by males. Now, in terms of education, we do find that female endowments have gone up, but that also happens at a very primary level of education. In secondary and tertiary education, again, is dominated by males. And other services, which includes domestic workers. So one gets intrigued to ask that why is, we are finding so many domestic workers who are migrating from rural areas to urban. Why should the share actually go down? Because in other services, there's a lot of other things, gardeners, drivers, plumbers, etc., and they are all males. So despite that increase there, this is not showing up because the other gender is still dominating a lot of service sectors. In terms of capital, again, a lot of expansion in capital endowments, 6.6 times is noted for education. For health, it's 3 times. So that's the order of the magnitude by which capital endowments in services have increased over time. So with that, my second stage of competition ends up, and I come to an estimation where I'm trying to see, so the title of the project is measuring. So having measured, how can we tie up this all to make some better sense out of all that we have talked so far? So I use a dynamic model where the lagged output helps me to study what has been the persistent in output structure. And then I see what is the effect of capital endowments and labor endowments on the industry structure. The unit of analysis is 3-digit, and I see industry. So from all that I have discussed and is stated in a little more detail in the report, 3 hypotheses that I could set out for myself were that capital endowments would have a relatively weaker effect on labor-intensive organized manufacturing, but they would have a weaker effect for capital-intensive unorganized sectors. So we are trying to test this, and side by side, a lot of insights also come up with regard to employment endowments, labor endowments as well. So I'm showing only 3 select slides here. There are 5 in the report. So if you concentrate on 1 and 3, 4 and 5. So 4 and 5 is essentially 4 refers to my industries which are only labor intensive, and 5 refers to industries which are only capital intensive. So I'm trying to see their differential behavior. And the first thing that I see is that the persistence of output is low. It is 0.05. So between a scale of 1 and 0, if it is closer to 0, it would mean that the past output, past industry structure doesn't have much of an impact, and it's very close to 0. That means the organized manufacturing is dynamic, it's spontaneous, it's able to act and it's able to react, it responses. So this kind of response we found absent in unorganized sectors, and I'll show you in the following slides. Now, the negative sign, as I told you in an earlier slide, that I'll connect to the finding on contract workers. Now, this is where. So the negative sign on contract workers, so the contract workers and the negative sign in the capital intensive segment is telling me, I interpret it in the following way, that it shows that there's a lower preference for contractual workers in capital intensive organized manufacturing vis-a-vis regular male workers, because probably the entrepreneurs are willing to retain male workers because of their stability and their building up in the system, being loyal, or maybe some other credits also, compared to using the hire and fire model, which is not as suitable for capital intensive organized manufacturing. So here is a scope where we can generate regular jobs in the manufacturing. This is the only way I could interpret that. A negative impact of endowments on female labor, which I saw in both cases, labor and capital intensive, of course, with different intensities, shows me that, you know, women will be probably at a disadvantage through expansion in the organized sector because of their incompatibility, because of the kind of trades they pick up in their education, in their vocational training setup. So we need to break the social norms, the social mindsets there if we want greater female penetration into the organized manufacturing sector. Capital endowments are stronger for capital intensive sectors, as we can see that the effect is 0.4 vis-a-vis 0.06. So definitely it's a huge differential impact. So what we would expect is a greater capital endowment of the capital intensive sector. Similarly, when I come to unorganized manufacturing sector, I see the persistence is much higher compared to, you see, this ratio is 0.4. It's much higher than 0.05, which I saw in manufacturing, organized manufacturing. It shows me that there's a stickiness, there's a rigidity, there's a constraint for the unorganized sector to move, to adapt, to be flexible. And we know that, we all know that, you know, those inhibitions are there with our smaller producers. So that persistence is a differential, is a, as I told in my lead slide, differentiate. I can see the difference right away. So that persistence is a big difference. And another point is that, yes, so the structure of labor intensive industries is more responsive. So if you might see, this is labor intensive, this is capital intensive, and the response is much stronger in the labor intensive segments than in capital intensive sectors. So this is where there's a thirst for capital. This is where this sector will immediately respond if greater capital is infused. But we need to be mindful, how are we infusing capital? I'll come to this point in a while. I come to unorganized services, my last empirical slide here, to show that the persistence is there, but is not, it has been there, but the negative sign shows that there is a change in the industry structure. So what was there is now contracting, and what was not there is now expanding. And I essentially view this through the expansion of trade-related activities, which was a tinier sector earlier, It has expanded multifold over the time. A stronger response of capital endowments is observed for labor intensive. So you can see it's 0.28 here, it's 0.16. So each of my three hypotheses are validated here. What were they? The underlying idea behind under them was that the behavior would be different in organized, unorganized, in manufacturing services, and labor intensive and capital intensive. So all parameters are showing that everything is going in a different direction. So we are in a spaghetti bowl. So I will not go to my findings because I thought I've given their due in my earlier slides. I'll come to the policy very quickly. So my policy with regard to capital is that it is necessary to define and follow the objective of domestic development of capital goods, because we saw the import, the effect of import utilizations, and we were a little worried there. And we also expect from our results and findings that capital use in manufacturing has improved, it will improve further, and this will help to benefit, take advantage from scale economies for the production sector. So how can we incentivize? We have been giving tax waivers and some tax holidays also, but largely these benefits have been confined to big ticket investments which are occurring in special economic zones and similar places. We need to come down to, you know, a little smaller scale also to encourage smaller factories to take up, you know, use of capital. With regard to relative use of capital, that means K to L ratios. On one hand, we see that skill upgradation is inevitable, we'll have to do, and which will also take make it necessary to design a business model where the entrepreneurs will need to be encouraged for on-the-job training, so that, you know, the moment they feel their employees not up to date, they shouldn't fire, but they should have some incentive to train them up on the job. On the other hand, this also makes it necessary to pay attention to strengthen the ability of our overall education, vocational, technical training systems to be able to correctly, we need to anticipate what is coming to us in future. In 5-10 years, we should be able to pin that down and then accordingly cater our education system to meet those demands. Because there have been studies that have shown that, for instance, an earlier study by our today's discussant and his co-author Gunajit Kalita on labor-intensive industries through a primary survey has shown that even in labor-intensive, the producers feel that they are constrained with the availability of labor, which is not competent to use machines. So this is years back, you know, maybe 14 or 13 years back, sir, if Dr. Das would remember it better. So that has been there, it continues to be there because we haven't been able to anticipate it. So policy targeted intervention. So that bubble chart that I showed you, now I'm trying to synthesize from that. So from there, in those 4 compartments, one can identify that if one wishes to work on industries where one wants to improve their capital intensity so that they can, you know, reap economies of scale, then the key industries that one would handpick would be textiles, leather, footwear, these sectors, basic metal products. So one is able to identify those sectors based on a criteria. So you decide a criteria. If that criteria is capital intensity improvements, these are the 2 industries you need to, sectors you need to pick up. Now, in view of their output in significance of these 2 sectors of textiles and basic metals, this is also this will also have an employment generation impact through realization of increased volumes. So, you know, it would be a win-win situation if these sectors can be focused upon. Now, if one would tend to focus on construction sector, if one wants to identify a sector with its employment potential, with its average, above average capital intensity, we saw the big bar was to the right in the top right quadrant. And which also has a high capital cost saving effect from import utilization. So since I couldn't show you sector level impact of import utilizations, it's sitting in the report. So this effect was very high for construction sector. Why? Because we are importing a lot of capital machinery, which we are not importing, which we are not producing in-house, because the number of producers are very less, and the fixed cost to initiate this kind of production is also very high. So that's why we continue to import. Therefore, efforts in encouraging the domestic manufacturing of capital goods, particularly the ones which are used in construction sector, will be of benefit to the economy. For the other manufacturing sectors, such as petro products, paper, printing and publishing sector, and non-metallic minerals. Non-metallic minerals have cement, glass, clay. These kind of products are sitting in this broader sector. They have very high use of capital intensity. We saw, this is in the report, and it is desired. So these are very high capital intensity, and it is desirable to encourage the domestic substitution in these sectors. And therefore, these are the top 3 sectors where 3 or 4 sectors where the policy can focus with regard to improving the domestic setups, and therefore the industry policy should encourage domestic R&D here. Food processing and trade, immensely important sectors in terms of their labor intensive nature and in terms of their size. And therefore, if one wishes to promote the sectors which can contribute in these 2 parameters, then food processing and trade sectors have been identified from the analysis. With regard to criteria-based intervention. So remember the other slide where I had showed some diamonds, some dots above and below one horizontal line. So I'm pulling these ones, these interventions out from that. So if one goes, if the policy thinks that, if the government thinks we want to focus on size-based criteria, an industry which is large, we will target that first. So the big bubbles, where were they? They were in construction, they were in trade, they were in financial services, they were in agri sectors. Now, if the government says, I'm going to be very concerned about where the employment intensity per unit output potential is sitting. So then these are agro sectors, these are agri sectors, processed food, wood, hotels and restaurants and construction. Now, if the intent is, okay, we will also concentrate on sectors where the capital intensity is actually low. It's below the aggregate benchmark level, so that we don't have much of a challenge there. Relatively, the challenge is low at a lower level. These would be financial services, miscellaneous manufacturing, which has a lot of stationery, toys sitting in there, textiles and footwear, electrical and optical equipment, and transport. Now, if the decision is driven by, we would like to, focus on capital intensity, then those sectors are business services, non-metallic minerals. Again, the cement sector comes here, and paper printing industries. So these can be scrutinized because these are high capital intensive sectors, and their import utilization impact was severe, as detailed in the report. So these are the sectors where the possibility of import substitution is stronger, and we can do good if we follow on our Atmanirbharta mission in a dedicated and a very clear, focused manner. For organized manufacturing, the window for regular jobs, I'm trying to connect to my earlier slide here, can be used to train and supply workers to the factories that will meet their skill requirements of capital intensive manufacturing. We saw that effect of contract workers, negative for males, was happening only in capital intensive industry. So this is where I can see that tiny window. And even more, that we saw that the returns to education in terms of the endowments of skilled workers, since they have been very maintained at about 12% of overall endowments, it shows that there is definitely an incentive to educate our people better, to come from blue collar jobs to white collar jobs. For unorganized manufacturing sector, a distinguished approach on support mechanisms is much needed. And so far what we've been doing probably is that we've been encouraging them to register, to come into organized sector, change limits. So probably what can be done is, instead of calling them into the organized sector, which would just make them more vulnerable, immediately they would be more vulnerable, their survival would be really threatened. The government traces them out in the informal sector and goes to them and attends to their problems. Their requirements are different than what the requirements of a formal one would be. It's almost like giving the ingredients of baking a cake to a person who's starving for a staple food. So that kind of a differentiation is something which we really are at a threshold. We need to be mindful of that. There are some other findings also, which I would skip for the moment, but the bottom one is most important: embracing technology in the micro units. So we are saying that we give you loans, and so that you can upgrade yourself and this, that, so that you become more competent and then you can compete with the organized sector. No, probably no, because embracing technology in the micro units has a different context, and it's probably not about doing everything in an AI manner, in a robotic manner, in a drone driven manner. The needs would be different. They could be different. For instance, a food seller would probably do sufficiently fairly at the moment if he's given some equipment where he can manage his food production of his food in some hygiene, if he's giving some sanitation equipment. So those things are really different, and we saw this different when in our COVID, in our pandemic package, there were many incentives that were given to MSMEs. And these were probably, for instance, I have noted them. So we offered them, they were offered collateral-free loans. They were offered subordinate debt stressed MSEs, and equity infusion through flow of funds was also an access they were provided. But what did we see? The outcome of it was that there were not many takers. About 63% of the units did not even approach to take these loans. And of those who approached, just about 1/3 managed to get them. And the utilization of getting loans from other sources other than those from the banking system was as high as about 36%. It's also important to note, in another lateral work, I noticed that the pattern of ownership of capital assets is very different when it comes to organized and unorganized sector. So the unorganized sector is using a lot of capital equipment on hired basis compared to the organized sector, which has under its own ownership. So if we are giving loans, we are definitely not meeting what they need at the moment. So this differentiation tells us that, apples and oranges cannot be served in the same basket. For unorganized services, trade activities will benefit most from the growth and expansion of manufacturing, because we saw that trade is coming up. And what will these small-time traders in the unorganized sector trade? They will trade only something which they can handle and which would be coming from unorganized manufacturing sector. So that's how we can tie them up together. So specific services will also have to be targeted to improve economic participation of female workers, because at the moment, the kind of services which are becoming predominant will not have a very sufficient scope for women participation. With that, I come to a closure. Thank you so much for listening to me. Hello?
Yes. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anjali, for giving us a very comprehensive presentation of your work. I think without any further ado, let me ask Dev Kusum to give his comments first before we ask or we open up the floor to all other faculty members. And then you will have a final word at the end to respond. So Dev Kusum, over to you.
Yes, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, please. Sure.
I must confess at the beginning that I haven't been able to read the full report. It's a very exhaustive report, but I'll be honest that I'm trying. I am I have skimmed through it, browsed through it, major part, and I would have some comments for it. At the outset, I think I would compliment the author for a very rigorous study. My first feeling was that when I went through the report was that I'm looking at a PhD thesis once again. And PhD theses are very rigorous in almost all aspects of methodology, data, findings, very that way. So that I take it as a very positive comment, that a lot of effort has been put into putting this study together, which is of, and especially when I hear about the policy implications at the end, it even shows the significance of a study like that. I wasn't aware of why was the word measuring all the time appearing, whether it's factor proportion or factor endowment, until I heard Anjali that was the title or whatever. Because my first impression was that too much emphasis was being put on measuring word throughout the report. That measuring the factor proportion, measuring factor use, measuring labor endowment, capital endowment, and things like that. But now that I understand the problem with this thing, I must say that I would have been more happier if the word measurement was used. If it could have been a study of factor proportion, factor endowment for the Indian economy, both aggregate and sectoral level. That's my first observation. But I completely understand that sometimes when you are doing a project, you have to follow to the last line what you mentioned about in the project title or the project synopsis. So that's fine with me. Now, it's a very, as I said, it's very well done. There's an introduction which looks at the methodology, objectives, contribution, etc., including policy relevance, etc. The review of literature has been well taken care of. Even the subsections created in the review of literature, particularly when I look at drivers of change in factor use, heterogeneity, factor endowment, market regulations, infrastructure deficit, substitution among factors. It's pretty well done. I have looked into the methodology chapter a little in detail. I've also looked into the factor proportion, factor endowment, and today in the presentation I heard about the econometrics, which I must confess I did not get the time to reach that far. My first observation is very interesting, that a general decline has been obtained in the total employment intensity. It's an important finding, but it's nothing very new, because we have generally been finding that employment intensity is going down. Second observation regards to capital, and capital intensity seems to have been observed to have increased. Now, my comment here would be that it is a well-known fact for the Indian economy that capital is becoming a very prominent player as far as the growth or productivity is concerned. And I would take a little bit of recourse to my own work for the claims project with Dr. Kumar and Anjali is aware of. We do find that as sources of growth, it's the inputs which are important than the productivity. And within the inputs, it's not labor, but it's capital. So in that sense, your findings are also very much in line that labor is relatively the non-important factor in the Indian economy, unfortunately, and capital intensity is going up. The other important thing that I observed is that when you talk in terms of labor endowment, we say that labor endowment for organized manufacturers have adjusted, and male and contract worker, the capital endowments for factory sector have more than doubled. Again, a very interesting finding. And labor endowment for organized manufacture transformed with regard to gender-based endowment, etc., etc. So in all, I would say that the results are pretty interesting. So, but I have a few important points which I want to highlight here, is that as I read through the thesis, the report, the first impression that I was getting, that first you're talking about factor use, then you're coming to factor proportion, and then you're coming to factor endowment. Am I correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay. And then, finally, you're looking at output, share, and trying to build up an econometric exercise. And you're doing this for the aggregate economy, you're doing this for the sectoral sectors. Now, my first question is, are you using the 27 sector CLEMS classification for entirely your study when you look at the sectoral classification? Is that the only, is that what you mean when you're looking at sector? Aggregate, I can understand, aggregate economy. Broad sectors, I can understand, but when you're sectoral, I see that yours, you marked them as S1, S2, S3 to S27. So my query is, are you using the CLEMS sector?
Yes,
All
so
through.
I'm expected to answer now.
Yeah, Anjali,
Okay,
let's
sure.
have this. I would be happy if you answer, because then I can further clarify.
Yes, so yes, so because so the sectors of analysis, so all industries are aggregated into sectors, and these sectors of analysis are based on CLEMS data, because at an initial point of time, when I was trying to make use of, so the advantage of CLEMS was essentially that it provides a time series. I had worked on labor and capital ratios from within IO for a specific year, but this time I needed it on a time series basis, for which nothing better than CLEMS was available, and more reliable also. So yeah, I used those sectors, and from those sectors, I then integrate the information from there into an IO framework to identify which sectors are labor intensive and capital intensive based on the information that I have used in my data sources. And yeah, so largely it's CLEMS. I had to design especially for other extension sectors, which were two manufacturing and two services, which were largely due to repair related activities, because of some 4-digit industries which I was not able to fix into one CLEMS sector. They were coming into two, so I had to weigh them out in some way or the other. But largely it's CLEMS driven.
Okay, thank you.
That is the domain.
Yeah, my broad comments here would be that in the report, you have so much of policy relevance, which you showed in the last slides. Somehow, when you're putting it in the conclusion, it's sort of, I feel that if you can put in a small chapter on policy conclusions, on the labor, on capital, that might add more value rather than pushing it through in the summary. Because what is the conclusion? Conclusion usually is summary of findings, what you're getting in each and every chapter, and sort of you're putting this summary in terms of your factor proportions, factor endowment, and you have a lot to say on the intertemporal behavior of this, across the sectors, how they're going over time, how they're behaving. So in your summary sections, you have enough to say on that. And then after talking about factor ratios, factor proportion, factor endowment, when you're going into the findings of your econometrics in terms of manufacturing, in terms of services at one scale, then organized manufacturing versus unorganized manufacturing at the other level, and then unorganized services, you have a lot of results to talk about in your last chapter. Okay, so I would think that, but these results, people will find them when they scan through your different chapters. So it's basically, you're putting them back together in a summary version. So, and since you say a lot of things about labor as labor endowment, on capital endowment, on labor intensive sectors, on capital intensive sector, I would generally feel that because a report must emphasize, and it will be a value addition to the report if you give a policy section. It may not be very big, but at least let there be a policy section on all the implications of your finding, because you're saying or you're talking about skill, you're talking about capital investment, you're talking about jobs, you're talking about gender, There are lots of things that are there. You're talking about food processing sector, you're talking about labor intensive sectors, you're talking about size, those sectors. You have put the policy implications under various formats, from various perspectives you're looking. So this will really enhance the quality of your report if you really give a standalone policy implication chapter. That's my first comment. The other, I'm pretty fine with your chapters 4 and chapter 5, just that it might need a little bit of rearranging. And also when you're looking at two tables, 93, 94, and just below that, you're giving 2007 and 8 on those tables of 2 different years. If you can punch them together, even if it's a big table, it becomes much easier to look at the changes. Then, independently reading a table which is 93, 94, by the time I'm reading the table which is 2007 and 8, I would have almost had to go back if I find something important. So the tables need to be merged together, especially when you're comparing two points, where you're comparing 2 points. And I strongly feel that this is important. Now, another very important point you're putting in is employment effect foregone because of imports. Similarly, you're putting in capital cost saving due to imports. This is a very important, this is where I think you're putting in trade, if I understand. Yeah, it is something like domestic value addition, foreign value addition, how are they important for jobs, how are they important for capital investment. I think you will have to a little bit re-emphasize those segments where you're talking about the employment effect of imported inputs and the capital effects of imported inputs. It did not read very clearly to me. It did not come across, the flow did not come across to me, because why from sector-wise total employment intensity are you going into employment effect of imported inputs? That connectivity, that why do I need to immediately connect with that, both in terms of capital and labor, needs to be a little more tightened up. And the continuity of the flow has to be brought in. And employment intensity, import utilization, aggregate level effects, all of these are absolutely fine. Now, let me go to your data chapter. Your factor proportions is well established. Your methodology and all are well taken care of. Now, I have a little issue when you're talking about estimating sector-wise net fixed capital stock. I'm not, my comments is not going to be that there's anything wrong here or things like that. I have a small query here. If you're using the CLEMS data for labor, why are you not using the CLEMS data for capital?
Okay.
Yeah, Anjali, I'd like to hear you.
Yeah, so thank you. So, so what CLEMS gives me? So CLEMS gives me number of employees. Either it gives me the number, or it gives me the labor income and capital income.
Yeah.
So at an initial stage, I was using capital income as a proxy for capital use.
Yeah.
Because the more the income, the more the capital use, with that kind of an assumption. But then over time, in my as I progressed, so this was still about more than a year of the project work. And after I came back from the conference where I met you, in my more detailed readings, I figured out that this probably net fixed capital stock would be better, because it's also for the reasons that a stock measure is more preferred, at least in your kind of productivity analysis. It has a better way. It takes into account obsolescence and depreciation kind of things also. And it's a, so I did, so, because it was income. So at some point of time I did receive some kind of feedback In some literature also, I saw if there's a better measure, because then I was talking about capital income. If I was talking about capital income, I could have easily picked up labor income also from there. Then my ratios were actually at an initial point of time, they were coming out as ratio of capital income to labor income as I drew them from CLEMS. But then over time, I thought I figured it out from my review work and also by presenting work in different fora and by discussing with some advisors that net capital fixed stock would be better. If at all, then in future, this paves the way for some productivity kind of analysis, etc.
No, my point here, Anjali, is that, I may sound advertising my own database, but the CLEMS 27 sector capital stock, capital services is by far the most sophisticated database of capital input by industry that you have in India today. And when you are also looking at the sectoral 27 CLEMS sector, I mean, I would have felt more comfortable had both the labor and the capital data been used from the CLEMS sector. More than the labor data in CLEMS, I feel very strongly about the capital data in CLEMS, because capital data has been constructed with the utmost sophistication. There is no database on Indian economy at the aggregate level, at the industry level, at the broad sector, then capital services, which CLEMS provide. So I would think that net fixed capital is fine that you've used, but maybe if you're doing a supplementary study or you want to check later on, you should work with the CLEMS capital stock data, because after all, this data set has been created for such work that you're looking at labor endowment, capital labor ratio, factor proportions and things like that. I mean, to use labor from CLEMS and to use capital from the other, would have been better. That's my first very strong point that I have. But that does not mean that at this stage you need to change anything, because the other very important thing that I observe is that you're looking into manufacturing versus services, which is fine, which is probably very good. I mean, you need to talk about, we all talk about manufacturing with our sophisticated labor, capital and all, but there is very little emphasis on comparing manufacturing with services. And you've done a very good job in looking at that. You've even looked within services, capital labor ratio. Now, what I find a little out of context, if I may say, you are looking organized and unorganized manufacturing. That's perfectly fine. These two sectors have their own story, their own limitation, their own challenges, their own everything. I don't know, CLEMS services is combination of unorganized, unorganized, the sectors that we work in CLEMS. And in unorganized manufacturing that I see, you have used NSS's data, which is fine. But some way or the other, I don't know how difficult it would have been for you, or was it not the mandate? I very strongly find the absence of an organized service. So you can always tell that it's very difficult to come up with organized services. We have not been able to break up CLEMS services into organized and unorganized. My colleagues who work with these, Professor Goldar and Professor Suresh Agarwal, tell me that it may be unorganized services. You can only work with the labor factor. It's very difficult to create a capital and things like that. So this is something, again, I find that, I mean, my natural question would be, why only unorganized services? Why not total services? If you're comparing, I understand informal manufacturing, formal manufacturing is very important. A whole lot of labor issues cannot be answered if you do not take the informal manufacturing, which is such a big employment generator. That is completely understandable, your division of organized and unorganized. To suddenly find an unorganized services without a counterpart, I mean, what purpose are you serving in your understanding? Are you comparing unorganized services with unorganized manufacturing only? Or what is the purpose behind just putting in an unorganized services here? That's my question, but you can answer it later. What is the purpose behind? The other important thing I find, and when you're looking at labor, you're very nicely talking about contract workers, non-contract workers, you're talking about female workers, you're talking about non-female workers. But your capital, you have not been able to go into very detail. The similar, that's a very weak part of this exercise. Had you looked, and I don't know how difficult what is, and whether at all you can do it with the national fixed cap, whether, in the cleanse, there is, that data is available on request, not in public domain. We break up capital stock into manufacturing, machinery and equipment.
Yeah.
We break up capital stock into construction, into structure. So that gives you the breakup. You have done very nicely for your labor by looking at the different components which matter: contract worker, non-contract worker, gender, etc. But the capital portion is slightly weak because you've not been able to compare a comparable perspective. Your capital portion is somehow, you've been very silent, I would say, when you're analyzing this, because I thought the capital portion just goes through very quickly to give you a glance, whereas you look at labor in very, very detail. That's fine. Labor is also important, but this would have really enriched your case if you could have gone into. Not many people do that. Labor, you do find contract worker. A lot of my work in ICRI are on contract worker, non-contract worker. All these things are there. But a novelty would have been come if you had been able to work out the structures of the capitals, the divisions, the components, and you could have said whether this investment in machinery is happening, structures happening. That is one of the other points that when you talk about labor endowment, you're very full on the different aspects of labor. But when you talk about capital, you're just talking about aggregate capital. You're not spreading it out into this. Because in your study, both labor and capital are very important, because a lot of discussion is going on, rising capital intensity, the labor employment intensity going down, capital going up. So I feel that, again, not to deter you from your serious work that you've done, but you've been the report has been rather weak on capital. And capital is a very important part of this story that you're trying to project. And the other very interesting part, as I said, why services only? At least a comparison between total services and total manufacturing would have been interesting. Just as you're comparing unorganized manufacturing with organized manufacturing, you have an unorganized manufacturing, you have an unorganized services. Just in that way, a comparison between manufacturing and services would have been also very relevant. And this is where the total services, I mean, without even going into, or a comparison of service, unorganized services. I do not know how, what would be the possibility of doing it there. And the rest of the report reads fine. I mean, as usual, even in the econometric section, the report is, I have one final comment on the econometric section. You're using a word output significant quite a bit in the report. Output significant, output significant. What is exactly? Is that the output share is very important? I think you need to be a little more technical with the output. Output significant becomes a little bit of a literary kind of, I wasn't able to understand. Now, in the econometric section where you're doing output share, why did you not try with GVS share, gross value added share? So would that be totally difficult to attain? Because sometimes the gross value added share is much more important than the output share and things like that. So that could have been an alternative dependent variable, may have, or maybe could have been a little important. But your findings from the econometric sections are all very well taken care. And when I get a little confused when I was looking at your results. On one side, you're talking about female and male workers. On the other side, you're talking about contract and non-contract kind of supervisory or thing. Now, when you are looking at even these categories like contract worker, are you also looking at a male-female separation? Because I thought you made a statement where you said that contract workers are usually male. So the thing is, are you looking at supervisory? Is the male-female on the aggregate side, the total workers, male workers, female workers? Or are you also dividing it when you're taking a subcategory called contract worker into male-female, when you're taking a subcategory called non-contract worker into male-female, etc.? Your results about gender in unorganized sector and everything is pretty well taken care of. Last point. The last point I'd like to make here is that when you say labor intensity, when you say you need a lot of capital, in your slide, you said something about some of the capital intensive sectors need to be improved and things like that. You know, you're suggesting as a policy to some of these sectors. I'd like to draw you to a work of mine with Kunal Sen, 2015 or something. Where have all the workers gone? The paper is called The Puzzle of Declining Labor Intensity.
Wage rental ratios.
Yeah, what we were finding there is that even in labor intensive sectors, the labor intensity is declining. So that was the cause, that if labor intensity is declining in labor intensive sectors, where are these workers going? So the usual thing to understand is maybe the labor regulation is a very important factor. That's why. But in that study, it is the trade policy which is making the price of capital cheaper in relation to the price of labor. So there is, because capital is becoming so cheap, there is, even in the labor intensive firms, there is what you call a substitution of capital for labor, and henceforth the workers are going away. So just when you do that, just put in a little bit of, address a little bit of that issue, that there is a wage rental ratio, which is essentially a wage rental ratio would be a technical point, but essentially would be that the trade policy has been so structured, the trade reforms, you've almost done everything that you could do for trade reforms. And as a result of which, it is now showing up that even labor intensive sectors are finding the labor relatively expensive in relation to cheap, intermediate, second-hand capital input, and there is a capital, which is again a worrisome factor, that trade policy was expected to improve competitiveness, or trade policy was expected to do something, but trade policy here is directly affecting the labor-intensive sectors. And most people try to sort of look into labor regulations as very standard, to blame it on labor market and things like that. I'll end there. Two very important points: services and capital is a weak component in the study, where capital labor, factor proportion, factor endowment, and are important. Thank you very much. It's a good work, just that these may be for future. If you do something like that, you can take them into account. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dev Kusum. I think very exhaustive, very comprehensive set of comments, and I'm sure Anjali would have benefited a lot from your extensive set of comments. And you began by saying that when you read it, it looked like a PhD thesis. And I thought this discussion was also like a PhD, Viva, Voci, or so I had a feeling that there was a PhD thesis being discussed. So the whole thing was very rigorous. I think the presentation, the work itself is rigorous, and the presentation was rigorous, and the discussion, by Dev Kusum was very rigorous.
No,
so
what I wanted to mention, Dr. Kumar, when I said it looked like a PhD thesis, because the PhD thesis is a very sincere, hard-working work.
Exactly. Yes.
Scholars' calendar of even, and I find the traces of that.
Exactly.
Meticulous details to data, to methodology, to that is why I put that it looks as if
exactly. Yes. No. I think the seriousness. Basically, we are driving at the seriousness of the effort, which is seen generally, or which is expected in a PhD thesis. So that was very visible. And I'm sure Anjali has benefited from your comments, and many of these are comments for your future work. And you can see how much of these comments can be incorporated in the present work and what is to be retained for the future. But we have actually spent all the 90 minutes that we wanted to spend. But let's open it up briefly for any other comments after, very exhaustive set of comments by Dev Kusum. I presume there won't be much, but let me open it up and check if there is anyone who wants to make any comments to Anjali. And then I will ask briefly for Anjali to sort of respond, not to all the questions, but some she wants to respond. Yes, I see one hand by Mohan. Yes, go ahead, please.
A very exhaustive study. I must congratulate Anjali for bringing up very interesting but predictable what do you call results. However, a small that may polish her report a bit. There is a lot of interplay of stock as well as flow variables. You talk of over time and at a point of time and things like that. So when you use capital stock, when you use labor employment, so that clarity little bit, if it can be brought about in this analysis too, that may be I think at my mind a bit more yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Another hand I see of Satiki. Go ahead, please.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Anjali, for this wonderful presentation, because we didn't get the opportunity to read the report. We will read later on. But it was really a very good study in the sense that it sets the benchmark for all of us to that we get the status of the different factor proportions in different sectors and what are the problems that we are currently facing. But the insights that you draw and probably the implicit value judgment that you make in this presentation, I have some comments on that. One is that when you are talking, the first part is basically about factor proportions. When you are talking about factor endowments, it is basically looking into the absolute values of factors and making a comparison between intertemporal comparison, or what is that when you are saying factor proportions, it is about ratios where you use the absolute values, and in factor endowments you are basically comparing the endowments in 2 periods. Okay, am I right? Okay, when you respond, you better clarify that. I was not able to understand that. The other point is that when we are talking about capital intensity, you have made a comparison between manufacturing and services, and studies show that capital intensity has increased both in services and manufacturing, but your work also shows that it has increased higher in case of services. And there I would say that you need to take into account the other processes which are into play, in the sense that it is primarily because of financialization. Because if you are able to make a higher profit through services activities related to speculation and other things, why would you invest in manufacturing? So there is a movement of capital from manufacturing to services also, and that is precisely because of this, which you can take into account while analyzing the things. But more importantly, what I would say, that your whole framework of movement of factors from one sector to another sector is basically picked on an ideal situation, that this is the endowment of our country and these are the factor proportions in different industries, whether they are matching with the endowments or not. If it is not matching, then your conclusion is that is not the ideal situation. And there you bring your conclusions. Now, my first point is, first of all, not necessarily in all the developing countries, the factor proportions always matched with factor endowments, particularly in East Asia, it didn't happen. So you need to take into account that also while concluding. So in many industries, in many countries, which are basically you start an industry and develop those industries where you do not have an advantage. The second important point is this movement is not actually driven by endowments. See, when we talk about a farm's decision, it is about profit maximization, which is not only the production function, but also the price set which the farm encounters. And that where Dr. Devkusum Das' last point comes into, that whether I will adhere a capital intensive path or a labor intensive path is not actually driven by the ideal situation based on the endowments of factors. And somewhere I find that you are not at all addressing this question while drawing the conclusions, in the sense that you are saying that this is the ideal endowments and so your factors should move accordingly. So that you can just bring into the discussion while making the conclusions. And I would say also that when we talk about labor intensive industries, my study shows that labor intensive industries also has the lowest, if you say, the share of wages in value added. That also we have to take into account. It is not about just employing people. It is not just about employing people. When you say that in unorganized sectors, it has become more labor intensive, I would say that that is not a very healthy situation, in the sense that if it becomes labor intensive, and if you see the productivity in unorganized manufacturing, if it declines, and it is about 1/7 of organized manufacturing on an average in different sectors, then it is basically a movement towards poverty sharing. The same value added is being shared by a large number of people. And this is not actually driven by the production function. It is not also driven by the particular situation of that particular industry. It is just a pressure of unemployment where people are finding employment in the informal sector and giving rise to a particular factor proportion. So what I would suggest that these figures and these findings gives a very rich data and also rich findings to come out with conclusions, but particularly for policies for India's industrialization and other things. But I would say that while concluding, it should not be only driven by the factor endowments, which is your reference point. So there are other factors that you can take into account while talking about the policy dimensions. That's all.
Thank you, Satyaki. I see one more hand, and that may be, I think we can conclude with that. So Akhilesh, over to you.
Yes, sir.
Quickly, please.
Yeah, I also congratulate Anjali for very good work and very nice presentation. And we are drawing very useful policy insights. One point I would like to highlight here is talked about lower application of the loans, particularly in the post-COVID scenario. Actually, but all the firms never apply for the loans, and it never happens. There is the voluntary and involuntary issue, and when the market situation is down, only selected firms who see that they can gain profit, only they will apply. This was the issue, and banks will also offer loan only to those sectors where they can find that they can gain, they can get the return repayment. There will not be any repayment issue. These points I want to highlight, and she has mentioned it in the conclusion and policy section, but this is not being drawn from her analysis. So this is my small suggestion. And since I have not read the report, so when I will be able to read, then I will be able to have better interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Akhilesh. So now I think we can have very quick comment or response from Anjali. You don't have to actually respond to all the points which have been made. These are all very constructive suggestions offered to you by Dev Kusum and other colleagues. So you can just quickly, sum up with what you want to propose to do with it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Das. Thank you, Dr. Chutani. Thank you, Dr. Shatiki and Dr. Akhilesh, for your thoughtful comments. So I think I should at least answer two key concerns raised by Dr. Das. So the key point was why total services, why organized services is not figuring out as an entity. And so just like there's an ASI, I didn't have an annual service industry, an annual survey of services. I didn't have an ASS where I could have captured organized services, because what I needed was at an enterprise level, I needed to work out their endowments, which I did not have. So, and that's what I've also seen in the earlier works of Professor Kathuria and his 3 or 2 co-authors. Their papers are published. I was referring to them very frequently and very intensely. So I did not have details of industry level services, service enterprises operating in an organized sector. One. The second key point, and at this, I completely disagree with you, sir, that you haven't read the report. You haven't skimmed the report. You have thoroughly scanned it, because the point when you say that capital is more aggregated than labor is, you wouldn't have caught it if you wouldn't have read it. And trust me that I took so much of time and effort to work out capital by different types of transport equipment, machinery, environmental equipment, computer equipment. That was my ambitious agenda, to have those 5 and 6 capital types, which are all added up today, what you see, the big figure. I wanted to do it that way, but it was turning out very difficult to handle. More so as I entered into the unorganized sector surveys, between manufacturing and between services, those reporting differences, and also those comparability differences of these categories within organized sector and unorganized NSS surveys. So that was making it very difficult to work it out this way. Your point on contract workers is also important for me to respond to, sir. So the way ASI provides, it tells me male workers, female workers, and contract workers and supervisors. Now, these contract workers could be males and females. We do not know. And that is why a gender kind of analysis, which I worked out, which I could do in an unorganized segment, I did not touch that aspect in the organized segment, because because one is not sure how many females are sitting into that contract labor. But I surely know how many regular females are there employed. But the contract is a sum total of males and females. So the data availability is a constraint. The structure of the data was driving me in capital also and in contract workers also. And of course, sir, this is to acknowledge, since you've come all the way for my presentation, I celebrated your wage rental ratio paper with Professor Kunal Singh. That was one of the most initial readings that I read in doing this work. And actually, I got lost into replicating those wage rental ratios. I spent about 6 to 8 months, and then I realized I should come back to my endowment stuff. And but that paper was very helpful in giving me a direction that, look, the labor intensive is also losing out on labor, and the blow is coming from the trade policy. That's what I tried to capture by expanding the IO framework here. And I do make note of what Dr. Chutani Dr. Shatki and Dr. Akhilesh said. So thank you so much for your views and your thorough listening to me. I'm sure I didn't test your patience beyond the limit.
Thank you very much, Anjali, for taking on board the comments which have been made. And I think this was a very rich discussion covering all your very good comprehensive presentation, very useful, constructive comments by Dev Kusum and other colleagues. I think this is the kind of rigorous, work and rigorous discussion that we need to have at this institute. And so thank you very much, everyone who contributed to this. I think the point Dev Kusum made, that you summarize your policy lessons coming out of it separately, that will make the overall report very useful for the policymakers, and I mean, it will add to the value of the whole thing. So with that, I want to really thank, Anjali, but much more importantly, our friend Dev Kusum for finding time to go through this voluminous work and sharing, very useful insights, which will be, I'm sure, very helpful to Anjali. And we look forward to remaining, in touch with you, Dev Kusum, and remaining engaged with the CLAMS and all other things that you do, because ISID, is about what you do in CLAMS, so industrial development. So I hope we can remain in touch with you and hopefully work with you, and collaborate with CLAMS and all that in coming years. So with that, thank you very much once again to everyone. And so then we can call it off. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr. Das. Thank you,
Thank
Director.
you, Anjali.
And thank you,
It's a
everybody.
very good study. Don't. It's a very good study. And if you feel, I'm happy to discuss with you over telephone.
I'll surely come back to you, sir.
Yeah, we can
I think that would be very helpful. Yes.
Yes.
That's very kind of you to have offered yourself. I'm grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye. 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 Bye.